Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Dr. Pam Schaff, and along with Dr. Erica Wright, who is the Associate Director of HEAL, I want to welcome you to our second Lunch and Learn of this academic year. Dr. Wright and I both were lucky enough to have today's speaker, Professor Rebecca Lemon, as one of our professors during our graduate studies in English at USC. Hers was one of my favorite classes at USC. It was on, I think, representations of drinking in early modern literature. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her. She teaches and researches English Renaissance literature with a particular interest in Shakespeare, law, philosophy, and the history of medicine. She's the author of Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. Her book uncovers an understanding of addiction as a form of compulsion or devotion, revealing the phenomenon's existence at least 200 years before its medical discovery. She's going to explain how the signs and symptoms of early modern addiction resonate with some of our own scientific definitions. And I think, actually, after a conversation we had last week, that her work can illuminate an understanding of addiction that really may help us with the care of our patients. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Lemon.
Thanks, Pam. Yes. I want to just say thanks to Dr. Wright and Dr. Schaff for inviting me. I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this project. The talk today, which for those of you who frequently come to these, you probably know, will run about 30 minutes, and then we have Q&A. And my talk today will feature two parts. The first part has a very simple thesis, which is that addiction has a long history. It wasn't just discovered in 1800, which is largely the consensus of medical historians, and it's also not then a modern phenomenon. The second, and this portion of the talk is going to concentrate largely on alcohol. I can say more about other substances in the Q&A because I began the project researching opium, tobacco, but I even had a moment of thinking about chocolate. I had colleagues who were like, you should do chocolate because of the 18th century. But I ended up, the archive on alcohol is huge. So, but I can talk about other substances if you're curious in the Q&A. And then in the second part of the talk, I introduce essentially a new paradigm for thinking about addiction, or rather I reintroduce a forgotten paradigm from the 16th century. Here, I'm going to argue that addiction is an intense form of attachment, and that under certain circumstances, it's in fact a laudable achievement. It's something to be celebrated. So the first half of the talk is history, and the second half is driven more by questions of ethics and philosophy. Part one, conventional medical history on addiction dates the concept to the turn of the 19th century. This is when physicians in both Britain and America diagnosed alcoholism as a nervous disorder. No concept of addiction, it's claimed, existed before this period. It was advances in medical science and psychology that led to its definition in both countries. First, around 1800, the British Navy physician Thomas Trotter, who's been called the first scientific investigator of drunkenness, argued that habitual drunkenness is itself a disease. The disease manifests in illnesses attendant on overdrinking, including universal debility, emaciation, loss of intellect, palsy, dropsy, dyspepsia, hepatic diseases, and all others which flow from the indulgence of spirituous liquors. So just keep that list in mind because it'll come up later. Nearly simultaneously, Benjamin Rush in America, who was one of the original signatories of the Declaration of Independence and a man deemed the father of American psychiatry, also defined drunkenness as a disease. He wrote, "Drunkenness resembles certain hereditary, family, and contagious diseases." Rush's work theorizes the trajectory from choice to compulsion. As he puts it, the use of strong drink is at first the effect of free agency, i.e., you choose to drink. From habit, it takes place from necessity, so that as you begin to drink more frequently, as it becomes a habit, it then becomes necessary. That this is the case, I can infer from persons who are inordinately devoted to the use of ardent spirits, being irreclaimable by all the considerations which domestic obligations, friendship, reputation, property, and sometimes even those which religion and love of life can suggest to them. The work of Trotter and Rush ushered in a new paradigm, medical historians tell us. This new paradigm constituted a radical break with traditional ideas about the problems involved in drinking. Specifically, opinion shifted on habitual drunkenness and then in turn on opium and other addictive behaviors to a disease model, a key feature of modern definitions of addiction. As the historian of science Roy McLeod writes, not until the last half of the 19th century did the scientific appreciation of alcoholism become general. It was too easy to view alcoholism simply as immoral excess, its cure, simple moral restraint, and its expense, a personal responsibility. In understanding the shift in viewpoint on excessive drinking, scholars not only stress the moralizing of earlier periods, as McLeod does here, but they also point to earlier conceptions of drinking as a matter of choice. Harry Levine, for example, discusses how during the 17th century and for the most part of the 18th, the assumption was that people drank and got drunk because they wanted to, not because they had to. By contrast, in the modern definition of alcoholism, the problem is not that alcoholics love to get drunk, but that they cannot help it. They cannot help themselves. This paradigm shift in the study of addiction is of a piece with other scientific discoveries of the period. Medical historian Roy Porter argues. Building to some degree on the work of precursors such as Erasmus Darwin, 19th century doctors set about investigating the pathology of excessive drinking, exploring its association with conditions such as dropsy, heart disease, cirrhosis of the liver, nervous disorder, paralyses. Current advances in neurobiological research further reinforce the link of addiction to pathology and medicalization. So just here's some of the folks. We happen to have folks who have actually influenced my own thinking here at USC. So I was very fortunate in devising this project to have such a host of folks to draw on. So using newly available scanning devices such as PETs and fMRIs to trace precisely how the addicted brain operates, neuroscientists have exposed the long-lasting changes in brain function caused by addiction, including the pathological usurpation of the brain's reward circuit learning. As a result of such usurpation, the rewired addicted brain releases dopamine in response to the anticipation of drug taking, rather than merely as a result of drug ingestion. This is important because it's not just a matter of withdrawing a patient from physical dependency on a drug. Recidivism is high when only physical treatment is offered. Environmental cues clearly play a role in sustaining addiction. The addicted brain is what neuroscientists describe as hijacked. The studies undertaken by USC researchers on cigarette smoking, for example, reveal the effect of brain lesions on drug addiction. The researchers found that smokers with brain damage involving the insula, you guys will know all about this, a region of the brain linked to emotion and feelings as well as conscious urges, quit smoking easily, immediately, and without relapse. So, viewing these neurobiological studies from a historical vantage point, we might say that modern research into addiction over the course of the last 2 centuries has become increasingly internalized, as perception of the disease has shifted from medical psychology to brain chemistry. It's no longer a social disease of a culture or even of an individual, but it's instead a pathologized condition of a portion of an organ, a small portion of the brain. Hence research into perhaps freezing that portion of the brain. Yet even as modern medical and psychological research illuminates the working of addiction in entirely new ways, addiction is not a recent discovery. My new book overturns the notion that addiction was discovered only a century ago, or in fact, 2 or 3 centuries ago. I show an awareness of alcohol addiction as a disease along the lines charted by medical pioneers and modern-day neurobiologists as far back as the 16th century. Using the Wellcome Institute and British Library Archives in London and the Huntington Library Archive here, I read through the medical, legal, theological, and literary materials left by Shakespeare and his early modern contemporaries. In the process, I tracked writers who chronicle addiction in terms of its ability to alter the brain and to produce a familiar and often repeated set of diseases. I just put this up because it's a kind of, you can see, this is, in some of the materials I read through, they have great woodcuts. and they're not like 100% integrated into this lecture, but I'd love for you guys to see them. So we've got a little smoker, we've got somebody who clearly had too much and has fallen over. This guy is either about to hit this other guy with his can, or maybe he's just drinking it all. So this is just some of the fun that people had back in the day. So to give some examples from the materials that I found, this is one of the visual materials. Puritan writers who generated texts such as, and here are some of the titles: The Drunkard's Cup, Diet for a Drunkard, The Drunkard's Character, The Condition of a Drunkard. They may seem to our ears moralistic, and in fact, of course, they are moralizing. They're Puritan texts about the horrors of drink. This is probably why this archive of material has been ignored by medical historians. But these pamphlets speak of drunkenness as a physical disease and a defining identity much earlier than the current narratives on the rise of modern medical addictions suggest. Puritan preacher John Downham, for example, elaborates on the two ways that drinkers abuse themselves. They abuse themselves first by drunkenness, when by immoderate swilling and tippling they are deprived of the use of their reason, understanding, and memory, so that as for a time they become like unto beasts. Second, they abuse themselves by excess, when, as they addict themselves to much drinking and make it their usual practice to sit at the wine or strong drink. Oh, they who addict themselves to this vice do find it so sweet and pleasing to the flesh that they're loath to part with it. So here's an image from another pamphlet. This is the drinkers as beasts. In fact, there was a very kind of extended theory about what people turned into when they had too much to drink. So some people become a fox, some people become a goat. And of course, each of these animals has qualities associated with them, like lechery or venery or whatever. So anyway, here they are. And that guy is charmingly throwing up. So Downham's concern for those addicts of alcohol stands in contrast to the widespread prescription following the advice of Greek physician Galen of alcohol in promoting good health. Alcohol was in fact crucial in the management of health, since beverages like beer and ale provided clean water and calories to their consumers. Indeed, alcohol consumed in moderation was thought to be important in the fight against disease. But excessive and habitual drunkenness challenged the Galenic prescriptions for self-care and provoked increasing concern from medical, legal, and religious authorities. Addicted drinkers suffer, writers came to argue, from disease. The daily bouts affect the drinker's brains, leading to a greater toleration for alcohol. In his sermons, John Hoskins, for example, warns that wine gives the brain a blow like a subtle wrestler. It may supplant the feet afterwards. So wrestler. I didn't change any of the spelling, so don't be alarmed that the orthography had not been standardized in this period. In Woe to Drunkards, we learned that wine takes away the heart and spoils the brain. While these authors had none of the modern tools that are available to 21st century scientists, they nevertheless anticipate modern research in their preoccupation with the drunken brain, as well, as I'm going to go on to suggest, with the drunken body. These writers catalog a set of diseases familiar to modern researchers and chronicled in Trotter's work above. The drinker, Downham and other critics of drunkenness argue, is brought onto grievous diseases, as dropsies, gouts, palsies, apoplexy, and such like. This catalog of diseases appears in nearly all of the religious discussions of drunkenness. Drunkenness leads to diseases of the body of man, as apoplexies, falling sicknesses, palsies, dropsies, consumption, giddiness of the head, inflammation of the blood and liver, distemper of the brain, deprivation of the sense, and whatnot, as the anonymous. I'm sure that's horrifying to you guys. You're like, that's so unspecific. You can't put that on a chart. All right, so this is the anonymous author of A Looking Glass for Drunkards. A Book of Christian Ethics warns of a great number of diseases, as catarrhs, rheums, swellings, gouts, dropsies do shake the foundation of our health. And the author of The Odious, Despicable, and Dreadful Condition of a Drunkard offers a similar list, which I put here. Thomas Beard, the author of The Theater of God's Judgment, links drinking and precisely these diseases again. He concludes, this is the one principal cause why men are so short-lived. Excessive and/or habitual drunkenness is, according to these writers, an infirmity accompanied by, and indeed provoking, a whole series of other infirmities. Drinking addiction leads, as anti-alcohol pamphlets chronicle, to the enslaved condition of the drinker. The literature on compulsive drinking is repetitious in the same way that this catalog of infirmities is. So the literature on compulsive drinking is repetitious, rehearsing the same medical formula on drinking and habit. The authors of The Condition of a Drunkard write that by long and desperate custom, drinkers have turned delight and infirmity into necessity, so that without wine, they cannot live. Samuel Ward writes of drunkenness, if once custom, ever necessity. And John Downham writes, the drunkard by his much tippling maketh himself a slave to his vice, and by long custom bringeth superfluity into urgent necessity. The phrase that's repeated in each of these texts, and there are many others that also do that, the phrase repeated in each of these texts, custom, i.e. habit, turns delight into necessity, comes from Galen. Custom alters nature. Writers adopt this Galenic medical formula, one incidentally invoked by Trotter in 1800, as I cited above, as an explanatory device in accounting for habitual excessive drunkenness. The phrase helps turn what might otherwise seem oppositions between choice and compulsion, between freedom and necessity, between delight and disease, into a continuum. One moves from choice through custom to habit and then toward necessity, to the point where without wine, one cannot live. Nearly all of the writings on drunkenness, this is yet another, we have some guys, some things happening that are not brilliant. He's throwing up. This is a practice, I can say more about this in the Q&A. This is a practice called health drinking, which is a kind of ironic term for binge drinking. So it's a pamphlet about the horrors of health drinking. Nearly all writings on drunkenness, from Puritan tracts to medical texts, catalog precisely this set of diseases linked to alcohol addiction and rehearse the Galenic formula on the compulsion to drink. Yet these early modern theologians are at the heart of a historical irony. It's largely religious preachers who explore the empirical connection between habitual drunkenness and a set of disorders linked today with alcoholism. Yet in the context of 20th century addiction discourse, these writers will be dismissed as ignorant moralizers, as proto-temperance fanatics, and as biased evangelicals, even as their writings anticipate modern medical definitions of addiction far more precisely than the work of their contemporary physicians. Physicians will eventually speak of drunkenness as disease, but they won't do so for another 50 years. And Edward Mannering is the first to do it 50 years after this. All right, so that's part one. Now part two, a new paradigm. So I have been discussing what my book works to establish, that addiction is a medical condition, indeed, it is a disease that was chronicled as early as the 16th century. It's not just discovered in 1800. But if I were to end my talk now, or if I were to have ended my book at this point, as I plan to do, you would be missing half the story. And you'd be missing the part of the story that is the most unexpected. I want to share this second part of the story with you, not only because I think a definition or understanding of addiction might be useful to you at some point in dealing with patients, for example, but also because it tells you something about the process of research itself and its serendipity. And I think that's probably something that all of us share, is that we're researching, we're learning things. And it's not, it's a creative process, and it's not always the most linear, even if you want it to be. So here's what happened. In the process of my research, I ran into a problem. The problem concerned a word. The word is addict. As I read through early modern archives mentioned above, the word addict appeared frequently in relation to activities that are clearly, from a modern standpoint, totally independent of addiction. They have nothing to do with addiction. In the 1530s, for the first time, the word addict began to appear in the English language. The theologian and translator George Joy was one of the first to use the word. He produced the earliest printed translation of several books of the Old Testament. In it, he praised the faithful follower of God as an addict, asking God to make fast thy promises to thy servant, which is addict unto thy worship. In other writings, Joy insisted on the unity Jesus preached. And you guys will enjoy the early modern syntax on some of these quotes. In other writings, he insisted on the unity Jesus preached, with the faithful addict unto none but Christ. So the faithful are addicted to Christ, saying that Jesus charged that his apostles, through love, might consent and godly agree, being all one thing in Christ, and that there be no dissensions nor sects in his church unto no creatures, being addict unto none but to Christ, her spouse, dedicating herself. The Elizabethan homily of good works then encouraged addicting oneself to prayer as a means of pleasing God. And that is the homily was read from all of the pulpits in the country, and it was placed in the churches. So it was a very impactful document, in addition to, of course, these new translations, which were similarly impactful. So addicting oneself to prayer as a means of pleasing God, where Humphrey Gifford counseled readers to addict all their doings to the attainment of life everlasting. The popular text of the Imitation of Christ similarly suggested that parishioners learn to condemn outward things and addict thyself to spiritual. Yet the author concedes the challenge of this charge. He writes how few there be which addict themselves to the study of celestial things, because few can withdraw themselves wholly from the love of this world. These theological writings encourage a model of addicted living that is at once an invitation and a prescription. Joy and others want their readers to become addicts, but they also acknowledge that addiction is not easy. It requires a natural disposition and ability. It is not purely a matter of hard work or instruction, and not just anyone can achieve it. As John Huarte writes, if a child have not the disposition and ability which is requisite for that science whereunto he will addict himself, it is a superfluous labor to be instructed therein by good schoolmasters. This quote always makes me a little happy, but also a little sad as a schoolmaster. I'm like, it's basically saying if the student isn't up to the task from the get-go, it's hard to teach them. But I don't know if I 100% agree, but nonetheless, it fits into a notion of addiction as a special kind of predisposition. These writers reveal something entirely new for those of us caught in modern medical approaches to addiction. For most of the 16th century, addiction in its link to God and service was not a problem. It was an achievement. To be an addict indicated commitment, vulnerability, hard work, and courage. To be addicted meant to devote oneself entirely to a calling. To be addicted to scripture, to scholarship more generally, or to Christ. Eventually, it's to be addicted to a beloved in a kind of spiritual, metaphysical union. Nevertheless, in its derided invocations, addiction might signal enthrallment, the relinquishment of good sense and true faith. So here's some of the other types of references. One might be addicted in Protestant England to the Pope. There's a lot of concern about that, or to superstitious practices like stained glass windows. Or one might even, as the down on quote suggests above, be addicted to alcohol. Thus, addiction appeared both laudable and dangerous, a commitment to salvation or to degeneration. In writing the first version of this book, I just ignored these laudatory references that didn't resonate with modern notions of addiction. I didn't think they were relevant, and they seemed at first to be mere curiosities, even if they vastly outnumbered the negative references. One might say they didn't fit into my paradigm for addiction. By the way, I ended up working with a computer scientist who was able to run the word addiction through all of the early English book online databases. So I can talk about that in the Q&A if any of you are interested. One might say they didn't fit my paradigm for addiction, but I could not ignore the word addict itself. I'm a literature professor. I'm someone who pays very careful attention to words and their histories. And the word addiction doesn't mean disease. It doesn't mean pathology. In its Latin root, it means attachment. The etymology of addiction itself, as addicere, to speak towards something, to declare, to assign oneself to something, is a form of pledging. The history of the word addict extends from Roman contract law. That's where it first comes in. Addicere, to assign, make over, to award, appoint, to enslave, and then to devote. The history of the word extends from Roman contract law, where to be an addict was usually a debtor, up through the 16th century, where addiction represents a form of commitment and devotion, offered out loud or in writing. In Thomas Cooper's Thesaurus, he defines addiction as giving over or bequeathing of the self. It is to say, to avow, to deliver, to sell, to permit, grant, or appoint to the same to some other person. In Thomas's dictionary, too, addiction is a delivery of oneself, both as voluntary and compelled forms of service. Addico, to addict, bequeath, or give himself to something, to say, avow, to alienate from himself to another. Thomas's definition presents addiction as a kind of constraint and a gift, as the addict consents to be overtaken. Indeed, the term addict contains at once a sense of obligation, as in its Latin origin in contract law, as well as a sense of choice, to bequeath or to give. This complexity of something that is and is not voluntary, something initially free but ultimately constraining, is the dilemma of addiction. How to understand the paradoxical relation of consent and restraint, a constraint within addiction. How to understand the awkward yoking of two apparently opposed impulses. How to understand giving oneself away as heroic. When I was writing the first version of this project focused on the history of addicted drinking, I had no way of navigating or imagining answers to these questions about compromised free will. I could not understand the notion of addiction's heroism, the ability to willingly give oneself over to someone or something as an achievement. But then something happened, something that should not have changed my research in any way. I had a child. How many parents are in the room? Okay, so we've got a few. This may or may not resonate with you. We'll see. And for those of you planning on becoming parents, I hope that this does not knock you off your game plan. And the process of becoming a parent allowed me to find an answer to those paradoxical questions that had initially stymied me. This was because in writing a research monograph about early modern addiction, I came eerily to hear how many of the terms of addiction that I chronicled in my book resonated with my condition as a parent of a newborn. It's true that I didn't have, mercifully, crudities, rheums, gouts, or dropsies, but I certainly lived in a state of compulsion, both required to and yet also wanting to care for a needy newborn. I was participating in a relationship that was at once decided for me and yet embraced by myself. In this imperative, I have to care for this being, like literally, legally, right? And reflexive, I want to care for this being. In this state that's imperative and reflexive at the same time, I chose to love in the face of behavior I would have previously deemed unacceptable or dismaying. Devoted to a needy, irritable, unsympathetic person who cries through the night, eats every 2 hours, and has little, if any, sympathy for my own well-being. It's kind of shocking. I mean, actually, how selfish they have to be, right? But so, of course, it's a totally different kind of relationship than with an adult-adult relationship. This is why Maya Slavovitz argues in her study of addiction that parenting, even more than coupling, requires the core addictive features of compulsive behavior despite negative consequences. So, again, this may seem familiar to some of you who are completely sleep deprived, and in fact, that may be true of med school itself, right? The kind of negative consequences in terms of your own sleeplessness, your own exhaustion. You're doing this to your body every single day. Why? Because you're devoted to something, because you are committed to it. So what had seemed entirely clear, the desirability and valor of self-possession, the horror of dependency and compulsive behavior, the nightmare of being subject to or controlled by another, was now muddied as a parent, experiencing commitment not as jail time, but as attachment, loving in the face of difficulties as well as joy, shifted my sense of what it means to be in relation to another. Furthermore, I was encountering two modes of compelled relation at the same time. One experientially as a new parent, and the other intellectually researcher of addiction. Reassessing relationships of compulsion and possession from my vantage point as a parent and writer, I suddenly became much more attuned to the moralization, not only in the sources for my book, but also in my own account of addiction in the early drafts, and furthermore in the field of addiction studies itself, which, with few exceptions, sees addiction as a problem to be overcome. Perhaps I thought it is worth reconsidering the condemnation of one set of commitments in the face of the overt idealization of the other. After all, one experience, parenthood, is ostensibly valorized, and book writing, a similarly overwhelming commitment, is at least tolerated. Yet, these experiences are marked by many of the behaviors associated in the modern era with a parallel, yet most often condemned phenomena, addiction. My experience as a writing parent finally opened my ears to what the early modern archive had been telling me all along, but which I had been unable to hear. For during the process of researching the book, as I mentioned above, I felt frustrated that early modern writers deployed versions of the word addict to account for relationships that, to my mind, were clearly not addictions, or at least they were not addictions from the vantage point of the term's modern definition. Yet now I began to look and listen more carefully to these unwelcome archival invocations and to investigate how devotion to God or to study or to one's beloved might in fact constitute addiction. And here came my key insight. I found that the apparently opposite outcomes of early modern addictions. Addiction might lead to the celebration of one's faith, vocation, or partnership on the one hand, or it might lead to sorrow, rejection, manipulation, or illness on the other, had obscured for me the shared process of being in relation in the first place. This is what addiction means, to be deeply related, to be deeply attached. Now, of course, the choice of object for that attachment matters. Whether we devote ourselves to our work or our studies or our families, or we devote ourselves instead to alcohol, opiates, or gambling. I don't want to diminish the harmful cost of some addictions. But it's important that we distinguish between the process of being addicted and the object of it. The process of giving oneself over to something, giving oneself over is something that our culture can celebrate and cherish, as with motherhood, devotion to work, or parenthood, devotion to work, or even maximizing one's earning potential. It is instead the choice of object that can be a serious problem. Choosing alcohol or drugs as the object of one's addiction over one's family or one's job is deemed toxic and destructive. But if we focus on the object as the problem rather than the process, we don't have to dismiss the whole person as diseased. In fact, the addict reveals a predisposition to deep attachment that's arguably an achievement in itself. I'm suggesting, based on my 16th century insights, that we might rethink the capabilities of addicts. Rather than pathologizing their attachment, we might instead recognize it as a misplaced form of devotion and commitment. Incidentally, I think this is why the 12-step program is so successful. It offers precisely the chance for community and attachment, and it allows its participants to acknowledge something beyond themselves, a higher power that seems to mean something to 12-steppers even when they're atheists. And this is why all these studies of the 12-step program are kind of baffled by the fact that a program that focuses on a higher power is so successful beyond all sorts of other medical interventions. And it's successful even when people say, I have no idea what the higher power is. I don't even believe in a higher power. To treat an addict by managing only their withdrawal from a substance has a very low success rate. Rehab programs that create community are more successful, but generally it's the sustained daily or weekly community with its opportunity for giving oneself over to a higher power in whatever form one finds it that works. That or finding another more acceptable addiction, like running, say. Ultimately, the addict poses an ethical challenge in the 21st century. He or she undermines the model of extreme sovereignty that Western culture currently valorizes. The addict challenges modes of control often posited as requisite for the life of health and well-being. Free will, agency, self-care, and autonomy are given over, often by the addict's active choosing. And this is a perplexing choice in the modern era. Such a position of willed compulsion is, in the context of the 21st century, pathologized. It's also politicized. At its extreme, such relinquishment of personal freedom can be taken to justify institutionalization or imprisonment. Yet the obverse, namely the valorization of individual autonomy and self-possession, has equal, if less advertised, risks, namely upholding isolation at the expense of connection. Are we at best just an island? Are we just isolated bodies that control ourselves through diet and exercise, employment and consumption? Are we most impressive when we manage ourselves perfectly, contain our bodies with the ideal weight, surround our large homes with the perfect fences, enclose ourselves in our shiny Teslas? We live in a moment that celebrates. I live in a neighborhood with a lot of Teslas. It's like, how did everybody at once get a Tesla? Like, it's just so weird. We live in a moment that celebrates self-sovereignty, the ability to control, regulate, and manage ourselves and our families without assistance or connection. I think that's even worth repeating. We live in a moment, in fact, that so much celebrates self-sovereignty that the ability to control, regulate, and manage ourselves and our families without assistance or connection is laudable. The notion that we need to ask for assistance or connection or community seems needy and even problematic. So perhaps in the context of the 21st century, it's not surprising that so many words that signal attachment have negative valences. Addiction and the other key terms associated with addiction, like conviction, commitment, and compulsion, used to represent the choice of attachment, but now they equally signal unwelcome outcomes. One might be committed to a spouse or to an asylum. One might have a conviction as a viewpoint or as a criminal record. One might be compelled by an idea or by the law. And certainly that's the case with compulsion. So this is just to end by saying, early modern models of addiction don't just indicate that substance abuse has a long history, which is where I started. Instead, these models of addiction offer one way of rethinking subjectivity through the ideological and ethical impasse of excessive self-sovereignty. Indeed, viewed through the vantage point of devotion to God, to study, or to a beloved, this language of devotional addiction encapsulates the rights and responsibilities, the volition and compulsion at stake in extended intimacies. It helps restore a sense of what is, according to Jennifer Nadelsky, who's a legal theorist I really love, it helps restore a sense of what is profoundly and irreducibly mysterious about the combination of individuality and enmeshedness, integrity and integration that constitutes the human being. Thank you. I just had to get a little Shakespeare in there. So there's that. Yes.
You mentioned at the beginning on the alcohol quotes, there was a lot of acknowledgement that the drunkard chose to drink at the beginning, but then was required to.
Yes.
Could not stop.
Right.
Did you see parallels in how that applied to the other kinds of addiction, to spiritual, where people started forcing themselves or wanting to and then couldn't not?
And then couldn't stop.
Right.
Not as clearly. I think the difference is, and this is again why initially I stopped looking at the word addict in the religious context, because in the religious context, it is, and this relates to the computer science person that I worked with, it's always positive, and there is not a sense, there isn't the medicalized sense that we get. That's the difference, right? So once addict begins to be used about alcohol, we then also get the chronicling of the diseases, and we get the use of that Galenic formula. So it's a really good question, but no, another way of putting it might be that what appears to be a negative compulsion in the case of alcohol, because it's not perceived as something that's at all problematic, there's never any understanding of it as like the difference between necessity and choice is collapsed a little bit when you're talking about someone's relationship to God. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting because we may, if you research, we may say that this word covers a field of meanings, and we're covering a field of meanings in generations. So maybe if we will summarize, maybe we will say that humans have a biological side that predisposes us to addiction, that it is normal. It is normal part of our behavior, and maybe for mammals, dog can be addicted to, attached to his owners, right?
Yeah.
And we actually reinforce this in some animals. So, maybe addiction itself, not bad, but just target of addiction is wrong.
Exactly, exactly. So the object, the choice of an object, and again, I don't want to cut the, there's pain, there's illness, there's death that comes from certain addictive choices, right? But I think the difference is that imagining a capacity to be devoted to something as positive, rather than suggesting this is somebody who is, as the whole, diseased, right? That in fact there's a kind of marvelous spiritual capacity that has been misdirected. I think it's just a much more sympathetic and understanding way of looking at somebody who might come to us and say, look, I'm suffering from this. It isn't a kind of, well, I manage to, control myself in all aspects of my life. It's the sort of claim to self-control, willpower. Why can't you just use willpower to, it's those kinds of prescriptions that I think are quite moralizing. And in the process of writing this book, I began to hear more and more, even in modern addiction discourses, there's a moralization, like somehow somebody has a failure of willpower. And I guess I just really think it's important to pose the question, is willpower all we are? Like, is that what it means to be human? Because I think that's an extremely depressing notion of what it means to be part of a human community.
Speaking of community, I'm not sure if I missed this or we talked about this, but in the 12-step programs that work for even those who don't know what the higher power is there some sense that the devotion could be to the community itself?
Yes, yes. And I think, so because of the fact there have been actually so many studies now on, it's perplexing, right? There's all of this research and there's all of this money and all of this time that goes to trying to figure out solutions. And then here is like this 12-step program that's kind of chugging along, right? And so, of course, then researchers have turned to like, why are they successful? And part of it is exactly that. It doesn't matter how you define it. The important thing is the release of oneself. I am powerless and I give myself over to this higher power. Yeah.
So, I would have assumed alcoholism goes way past the 16th century.
Further back, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes. All right, so this is the thing. I wrote a whole first version of this book that was about drinking, and it went back to the very first references to drinking in Alfric's sermons back in, 1100. And so I looked at, and so then I was studying the kind of comparative paradigms, so that initially drunkenness was part of the 7 deadly sins, and there was a specifically overtly moralizing framework. The book, as I then wrote, so you're absolutely right. Nobody used the word addict. Addict comes into English in the 1530s, but people did describe drinking. They described it often in satirical terms, or as I say, through the rubric of the 7 deadly sins. So when I finished that first draft of the book that was like predating addiction to say, oh, here it is in the 1600s, but actually it existed even before that, it was really boring in a way, right? Because what are you going to say? I mean, then I say, oh, 1100. I mean, aren't you going to then say, I worked this guy, Peter Moncall, I think, gave a talk in this series, and he and I ran a conference on addiction where we had somebody who was talking about medieval Iran who came, and right, so it's global and it's transhistorical, drinking and problems with drinking, but the specific medicalized notion of addiction is this is the earliest I could find evidence of it from kind of Downham is really one of the first guys, the 1580s.
So one of the thoughts I have is there's a difference in drunkenness and alcoholism, and I can see drunkenness being one of the 7 different sins for a number of different reasons. But and actually the question of supply of alcohol also comes up for me. I mean, I don't know how, I'm thinking, weren't there alcoholics in Greek times? And if not, was that because, why wasn't that so? Because there wasn't enough supply, because there were better communities, people were connected better. I think I have a question here somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, if what you're suggesting is alcoholism could be transhistorical, and it could be everywhere, and yet there could be moments where it's less acute because it's community, because people are attached. Well, the interesting thing in England is that generally it was pretty low alcohol content, but people drank beer from the time they got up in the morning until the time they went to bed. Now, again, it was very low alcohol. This is why we did the research for the class, because basically that was their water supply. So one of the things, and this is true with the case of tobacco and opium, one of the things that happens is, in the case of the 16th century, England fights in the Dutch wars. They go to the Netherlands and they support the Protestant cause against the Spanish. All of the soldiers who go over to fight are then introduced to Dutch lager. And Dutch lager then makes a kind of inroads. And this is actually still true for those of you who ever travel to England. If you go to a tavern, my advice to you, if you're at a country tavern, is order the low alcohol local ale. Don't get the Dutch, don't get whatever, Stella or Foster's, the Australian one. But anyway, so once this came in, it had much higher alcohol content, and it put out of work all of the brewsters, the female brewers who had traditionally always made ale in homes. And similarly with gin, right? So there are these moments of acute concern for alcohol consumption. And one of them is, at this moment, you might say, of the introduction of higher alcohol lager. So people have the same drinking habits, but they're drinking something that's higher alcohol, so they suddenly are getting more drunk. And then in the 1730s with the introduction of gin, right? Now you're distilling it, it's available very cheaply, people are drunk. And there was a kind of class component to that. Similar, opium. People had laudanum in England for quite a long period of time to help with, as they would always put it, bone ache, toothache. But it's when the British, through the East India Company and other companies and trade routes, were introduced to the practice of smoking opium, that then things categorically changed. So part of the reason why I ended up focusing on alcohol is because there's a continuity to it, whereas tobacco and opium were new substances, where part of the discourse around it was always a kind of xenophobic concern for the countries where these practices or these substances came from. So that became something that was just not in my purview, the project. Did you have a question? No? Yeah.
I was curious if in your research you found much difference between men and women.
I mean, one thing to say, okay, because at first, because it was going to be on addiction and alcoholism as a physical, drinking thing, it's very hard phenomenologically to look in archives and find a phenomena, right? But one of the things that I noticed between men and women is that there's a certain kind of masculine drinking culture that may even, in fact, be familiar to us still from, say, fraternity life. And so the health drinking that I said was something that groups of men would do. It was a form of binge drinking. They would all say, to your health, and you have to drain your whole goblet, and then, they would say, to your health, and you drain your whole goblet, and then somebody's like, you left me out, I'm really insulted. So then next thing you know, you have to do 8 drinks. if women participate in the same practice, you can imagine, okay, that was not, they were called gossips, and there was a sense that they were at the tavern and they had loose tongues and they were saying all sorts of things they shouldn't, and it was kind of endangering the community. And so there was a lot of ink that was spilt on women drinkers. The other thing was that, and I think this is part of the propaganda of the rise of the kind of more corporate beer industry, is that the woman who would generally have been making beer at home, the brewster, or selling it at her ale house, is then horribly satirized as somebody who is dirty, who is pulling short poles, who is adding water, who has dirty glassware. So there's this long satire of this woman. It's called The Tunning of Eleanor Running. And it basically is about all of the ways in which she is a liar and unclean, and one should never drink her ale. So there is a gendered component for sure. And then women work in the taverns. So in the case of Henry IV, if any of you have ever seen this play, Falstaff kind of abuses Mistress Quickly, who is in charge of the tavern where he drinks. And he has a huge tab, and he's clearly never going to pay for anything. And she just hopes that they're going to get married, which they never will. So
that picture too, with all the, not that one, but the drinkers turning into monsters, or not monsters,
right.
Animals. So there's the female barmaid is the only human in that picture. And the rest are.
See, that's a good point, because that was often the idea, was that women were the workers in these spaces. So I have pulled out all of these uses of addiction, the kind of history of this word, but part of the reason that the first version of the book was all about drinking is because the archive is so rich, right? There's so much stuff, and there are these like extremely detailed taxonomies of what happens to people when they drink. Here you are, and you turn into this, and you turn into that, and when you become a goat, you get like this, and so I think that I don't know what kind of animal this is, and I think that's the donkey, and sheep. Some people are sheep, which probably doesn't bode well for them.
Well, thank you so much for not only a conversation through history, but I just think both the sense of what we can learn about community and about what our work is like. I also found your comments about research and serendipity really relevant for the work that we do too. You never know where we're going to come across a discovery that really helps us understand better.
Yeah.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.